Welcome back, everybody. We're now going to look at part two of my lectures on brief history of the art market. I guess this is mainly aimed at two types of student or audience. Those who've done pure art history and they've never had any references to the art market, but also to those people who haven't really studied art history because of my chronological approach. You can also pick up some art history in these lectures. So last time, just to remind you, we learnt that the art market in antiquity had already developed into an exchangeable commodity, where art was an exchangeable commodity both local and internationally. We learnt that there were primary and secondary markets where, for example, Greek vases would be made in Athens and sold to Athenians who get fed up with them and then sell them on what we call the secondary markets to, for example, the Etruscans in North Italy. They're often discovered in North Italian tombs, these Athenian vases. We learnt that there was an exotic attraction to foreign art, like the Romans in particular, very much enjoyed looking at Eastern Mediterranean Greek art, collected it and looted it. We learnt that the first artist's signatures appear in the 6th century BCE in Greece. We learnt that artists were being paid, that they became competitive, artists themselves competed with one another, and collectors competed with one another. Artists became culture heroes, some artists, and there were some women artists even in the ancient period. There were listings of art, inventories. There was collecting and replication of older art, Romans collecting earlier Greek art. There were auctions developing in the Hellenistic and Roman worlds for works of art. And there were art advisors advising people, wealthy clients in Rome who didn't have enough time to really understand the art market, so they would rely on art advisors. We also saw how in the medieval period, at the collapse of the Greco-Roman classical period, art commission really moves to religious groups, Christian religious groups. And now we're going to move into the early Renaissance. So the quality of artistic production continued to be regulated by medieval guilds. And in the north of Europe, this could stifle collective creative developments as well as individualism. In early Renaissance Florence, however, local politics, as in democratic classical Athens, had a remarkable effect on the social status of art and artists. So the people of Florence celebrated this artist, Giotto, as a culture hero. We're actually looking at a work of art he did in Padua for the famous Arena Chapel. Sorry, the spelling there, chapel. So Giotto became celebrated as a culture hero on account of his ability to paint reality, something that looked more real than medieval art had looked. Just as in the ancient world, Giotto was artists like Giotto were awarded what we call the freedom of cities, and that had already been awarded to the painters Eutzes, who'd also created these imitations of reality, what we call mimetic painting. Like Athens, Florence involved all of its citizens in political governance, and this included the commissioning of public art, leading to a large proportion of the population necessarily acquiring views on aesthetics. They're seeing, as in the Palazzo della Signoria, for those of you who know Florence, they're seeing works of art by famous artists. It's on public view, it's not just privately collected. The emerging republican, more democratic system in cities like Florence and Venice was quite similar in many ways to philosophical notions, utopian notions of democracy that are developed in 5th century BCE Athens, seen on the upper part of the slide. The heightening of artistic awareness, this is my own text because this is something I'm hoping to publish, combined with the economic growth of the city and its middle class, as well as the encouragement of individual creativity amongst its artisans, provided the essential ingredients for a dynamic art market. The cultural climate was so very similar in places like Florence and Venice. in this Renaissance period to classical Athens with writers, philosophers, and mathematicians, all exchanging views with architects, sculptors, and painters. The emergence of the artist as individual is witnessed in the page of Vasari's Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, published in 1550 for Duke Cosimo I de' Medici. It's in the bibliography. Medici, creator of the Uffizi Gallery, which is still a star place to go if you visit Florence as an art gallery. Vasari places Cimabue, this artist we're looking at the start of the Renaissance, because he says that Cimabue was the first to learn how to paint like the ancient Greeks, and not in what he called the rude manner of the modern Greeks. And what he meant by modern Greeks were the Byzantine culture that had developed at the fall of the Roman Empire. The center of empire moved to Constantinople, the city of Constantine, which was the ancient Greek Byzantium. And we call all of the Christian medieval art that developed in the Eastern Mediterranean Byzantine after that. The slide you're looking at the moment is, I highlighted the acquisition history because in fact, a Sotheby's expert had recognized this as a Cimabue when he was looking at an English country house collection and valuing it. And after the death of the owner, the Sotheby's expert had recognized that this was a Cimabue. The owner had no idea what it was. And it was eventually accepted by Her Majesty's government, His Majesty's today, then in 2000, Her Majesty's Elizabeth II, in lieu of inheritance tax and allocated to the National Gallery in 2000. You can see it there in room 51. The National Gallery didn't have any Cimabues before this, so this is one way that public museums with no money can acquire works of art, because there's a large inheritance tax of 40% on estates when people die in the UK. I think it's similar in other countries. And one way of getting around this is by important works being allocated to public display and consumption, and then you get money off your tax, your inheritance tax. You can see that Cimabue is already moving from the medieval period. So what is still medieval in this painting is the gold background and the expense of gold compared to the artist's hand, which we'll see later people come to want to pay for more than the materials. And the increasing naturalism. You can see the Virgin Mary, the mother of the infant Jesus Christ. Jesus is playing with her hands in the way a baby will. His head remains too small. These are, that a baby's head is much bigger. So these are gradual developments into naturalism. You'll also notice the perspective of her throne. Cimabue's pupil was, of course, Giotto, and Vasari tells us, quote, "The child not only equaled the manner of his master, but became so good an imitator of nature that he banished completely that rude Greek, my square brackets, Byzantine manner, and revived the modern and good art of painting, introducing the portraying well from nature of living people." That's a quote from Vasari, who was alive in the 16th century and is our main source for the history of particularly Italian Renaissance art. You should read it. We also begin to get the development of materials, we have seen the development of materials in the medieval period as valuable, and that also existed in ancient Greece and Rome. The idea that what a work of art is made out of is almost more expensive than the hand of the artist. And here's Giovanni Bellini's 15th century painting in the Frari church in Venice. And the blue colors of the Virgin Mary's cloak are created from this substance called ultramarine. Ultramarine means from beyond the seas, lapis lazuli, and it was brought from Afghanistan, and it costs more by weight at the time than gold. In the 15th century, most paintings and sculptures continue to be religious. However, during this century, just as in the modern world, a new type of wealthy patron emerges, the merchant banker. The Florentine Medici family is the most famous example, and it's significant that by the 1470s, Sandro Botticelli, seen in this slide, is painting the new fashionable subject of ancient mythology for his secular patrons, as well as the more traditional religious images. You'll see both types by Botticelli in a collection such as the National Gallery. Recent readings of these mythologies have suggested that they may have had more spiritual Christian meanings underlying their sexy pagan surface narratives. The Venus and Mars in the National Gallery, London, might have represented the fall of Adam and Eve, as well as the ancient divine lovers. You'll read more about this in my article in the bibliography, my chapter I wrote on this painting, that I wrote in 2010. The painting also offers an example of the abandonment of expensive materials in favour of Botticelli, the artist's own skills. What appears to be golden braiding on the hems of the women's tunic here is just cheap earth pigment when it's analysed, cleverly mixed by Botticelli to produce the illusion of the valuable metal gold. Botticelli's contracts that have survived demonstrate this change from the medieval desire for expensive gold leaf and ultramarine blue that we saw in the Bellini altarpiece just now, brought into Italy, as the name suggests, from far beyond the sea, as the Afghan precious mineral lapis lazuli, as I've already said. Now, as in ancient Athens 2,000 years earlier, what merchant patrons such as the Medici banking family really want is the ownership of the artist himself. So in 1485, Giovanni Daniolo de' Bardi pays Botticelli to paint an altarpiece for his family chapel in the Church of Santo Spirito, Florence, quote, 2 florins for the ultramarine, 38 florins for the gold and preparation of the panel, wooden panel, and 35 florins for his brush. That book by Baxendale is in the bibliography. The artist himself has become a financial asset, and his value is the equivalent, if not more now, than the costly materials of gold and lapis lazuli. It was not to be long before the materials ceased to matter at all. The rebirth of the artist as a branded individual and celebrity we're going to look at now. So the idea of the artist as an individual genius leads to a new relationship between the artist and their patron. The most revered Renaissance artists were able to name their own prices as demand for their work by competing patrons outstrip supply. This also meant that they became increasingly itinerant. They moved around, traveling from one city to the next to fulfill the commissions of their various patrons. So Botticelli, born in Florence, moves to the Vatican in Rome because Pope Sixtus IV pays him handsomely for his work as master of decoration of the upper walls of the Sistine Chapel. And you see this in this painting on the slide. The massive increase in Botticelli's fame rating, as we would refer to it today, which results from his acceptance of this role, is a result of several factors. His patrons now include both secular and sacred celebrities, the Medici bankers in Florence and the head of the church in Rome. And his works are located in the most prestigious palatial spaces of Italy, including the Sistine Chapel. And he's head of a group of the most important artists of his generation, with Perugino, Ghirlandaio, Signorelli and Rosselli all working under his direction on the Sistine walls. These associations of an artist with celebrity patrons, prestigious locations, and the best contemporary artists are still considered today among the essential features of investment potential in the art market. Non-monetary art ranking systems that we use in the Institute, such as Art Facts, employ points ratings for their artist fame rankings based on their presence in prestigious galleries, along with what other artists they're displayed with. And Botticelli would have indeed ranked high on these lists. The financial independence enjoyed by the most successful Renaissance artists gave them a degree of aesthetic freedom not enjoyed by the artisans of the medieval guilds. This led not only to relatively rapid stylistic developments in the ensuing centuries, but also to frequent conflicts of interest between artists and patrons, the bitter arguments between Pope Julius II and Michelangelo, seen in this slide, of course, over the content and style of the Sistine ceiling frescoes are really well known. You can also see in the bottom left of the slide some of those the canvases on the walls that Botticelli painted and commissioned other artists to paint along with him. but it's all kind of capped above the clerestory windows that bring light, natural light into the chapel by the fantastic ceiling and eventually the altar painting of the Last Judgment by Michelangelo. But the bitter arguments between Pope Julius II and Michelangelo are famous, and they're celebrated in modern popular culture in the 1960s Irving Stone book and movie, The Agony and the Ecstasy. Recommend you look at that or read it. Michelangelo, like Botticelli a generation before him, came to work for the Pope in Rome after early years in Medici Florence. And he's arguably the most influential prototype of the celebrity artist of the modern and contemporary world. In terms of individualism, Michelangelo went several stages further than Botticelli, throwing out all the other artists working for him on the Sistine ceiling and locking himself in until it was completed. Vasari ends his chapter of Michelangelo's life with the following quote: His Holiness, the Pope, often seeing Michelangelo, would say to him that the chapel should be enriched with colours and gold, since it looked poor. Povera, the Italian word. Michelangelo would answer the Pope familiarly and cheekily, Holy Father, in those days, the time of Jesus, time of ancient Greeks and Romans, men did not bedeck themselves with gold, and those that are painted there were never very rich, but rather holy men, on which account they despised riches. Michelangelo received 3,000 crowns from Pope Julius, spending just 25 on his materials. The old medieval equivalence of expensive materials with financial value was thus destroyed by Michelangelo forever. And it's typical of Michelangelo's spiritual humility that he referenced not himself, but his God. This shift is mirrored in Ming Dynasty China, where literati painters, as we call them, were valued for their brushwork and poetic inscriptions. You see here in this wonderful scroll painting. Often they're valued more than the materials used. Their works were collected by scholars and officials as expressions of taste and intellect. The idea of the artist as an individual genius leads to a new relationship between themselves and their patrons. The most revered Renaissance artists were able to name their own prices as demand for their work by competing patrons outstripped supply. This also meant that they became increasingly itinerant, traveling from one city to the next to fulfill the commissions of their various patrons. During the late 15th and 16th centuries, wealthy Italian patrons created miniature private galleries called studioli, which housed exquisite collections of just a few select art objects, often antiquities mixed with contemporary art of the time. Isabella d'Este, seen here, the Marquess of Mantua, had her own studiolo in the Gonzaga Ducal Palace. You can still visit it, where she created a program of paintings on the theme of the victory of virtue over vice. The court painter Mantegna provided several canvases for her studiolo, but Isabella was frustrated by what she considered his old-fashioned style and in vain attempted to solicit works by the new generation of artists such as Leonardo da Vinci, who was meant to paint her portrait but only produced this sketch, now in the Louvre. Similarly, my quote, in today's art market, demand for works by the best contemporary artists far exceeds supply. This enables dealers to select who buys their artist's work. The preference is always for established and trustworthy collectors. The market value of the work is boosted by elite provenance of the new owner. And the client is trusted not to what we call flip the work by selling it too soon at auction, which would lead to a loss of pricing control by the dealer. The demand of collectors for anything in the Renaissance by Leonardo was great indeed, when the likes of patrons like Isabella d'Este were unable to even secure just one painting. During the 16th century, perhaps the most significant development affecting the art market is the growing international reputation of individual artists. Although there had never ceased to be an import-export trade of art objects in the antique, medieval, and early Renaissance period, you remember the St. Albans altarpiece that was brought from Lombardia in northern Italy across the Alps and across land and into Great Britain. So although there had never ceased to be this import-export trade, the works were not bought and sold because of the brand name of the artist, but because of the lack of local productions of similar quality to the imports. This changes dramatically with Venetian painters such as Titian seen here and Tintoretto. Their work was not only in demand throughout the Italian city-states, as had been the case with earlier artists such as Botticelli, Michelangelo, and Leonardo, but they also received commissions from the great European kingdoms of France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Titian, unlike Tintoretto, travelled within both Italy and Europe, and whilst at Augsburg, received an annuity of 200 crowns from Emperor Charles V as an attempt to become his major patron. Unlike Tintoretto, who remained in Venice and apparently cared little for how much he should be paid, Titian had a shrewd eye for the market, was always on the lookout for bigger and better international patrons, the greatest being Charles V's son, Philip II of Spain, for whom he painted both portraits and, this is one of them, the famous series of poesie or poetry paintings based on the ancient Roman poem by Ovid called the Metamorphoses or Shape Changes, arguably, by the way, the most popular Latin text of the Renaissance and translated into all the vernacular languages more than any other ancient poem. The original royal provenance of the Poesie means that these paintings remain today amongst the very hottest works on the rare occasions when they appear on the market. So, for example, in 2007, this painting of the Ovidian myth Diana and Actaeon was offered for sale by the Duke of Sutherland from Scotland, eventually being bought in 2009 for a record £50 million by the British nation with the help of American friends of the National Gallery to be shared by the National Galleries of Scotland and the National Gallery London. Realizing that this level of public funding is limited, in 2012, the Duke also released its pendant painting, i.e. a pair with this, called Diana and Callisto, for, quote, the reduced price of £45 million. And it's significant that Lucian Freud died about 10 years ago, great modern British painter. He used to hold the world record auction price for any living painter. He described the two Titian canvases as, quote, simply the most beautiful pictures in the world. Of equal significance to today's art market, with high-end paintings being sold to the nouveau riche magnates of minerals, oil, and gas. The painting entered Great Britain when it was bought by the coal magnate Francis Egerton, 3rd Duke of Bridgewater, in 1798, during the sale of aristocratic art collections following the French Revolution of 1792. You know, French Revolution, get rid of the monarchy, get rid of the aristocrats, loot their palaces and houses. The Louvre, which had once been the royal palace of Louis the 16th, is turned into a public space and remains that. Oh, I just wanted to add that similarly, Lucian Freud's just mentioned him as a lover of Titian. His painting, quite controversial painting, portrait painting, Benefit Supervisor Sleeping, was sold to the Russian oil magnate Roman Abramovich, who also used to own Chelsea Football Club and, of course, no longer because of the invasion of Ukraine. He purchased that painting by Lucian Freud in May 2008 when the art market was at its height at Christie's, New York, for $33.6 million. So, just a little introduction to the next part of the lecture, which I could label from patronage to plunder, because a lot of the works we're going to see now are to do with imperialism, plundering, acquiring works of art that aren't really your legal title, ethically or legally. So art in the age of empire. So as European powers expanded their global reach from the 16th century onwards, remember, Christopher Columbus had already traveled from the Hispanic Peninsula to and discovered America at the time of Botticelli. This leads, of course, to conquest and colonialism and looting of local people's art and materials, of course, gold and jewelry. So the art market from now on becomes entangled with imperial conquest. Art collecting shifts from elite patronage to imperial acquisition. Looted artifacts enter European collections as trophies of power, just like ancient Greek art were trophies of Roman power. Looted artifacts entered European sorry, the market absorbs sacred and ceremonial objects as exotic commodities. We might ask what the ethics of that are. This period marks the beginning of a globalized art market as we live in today, still unfortunately shaped by some colonial violence and cultural appropriation. So coming back to our chronological survey of history of art and its markets, a glimpse into this world of aristocratic art collecting, in which aristocrats begin to visit the art collections of the Nouveau Riche, can be seen in Willem van Eyck's painting of the private art collection of the wealthy Antwerp spice merchant Cornelis van der Geest. In this painting, very famous painting now in Antwerp in the Rubenshaus collection, you can the members of the Spanish and Polish aristocracy seen down here in the bottom left corner are shown paintings by their host in the presence of the painter Rubens and his industrial pupil Van Dyck, who eventually became the royal portrait painter of King Charles I in this country. In this period, a notion of a hierarchy of artistic genres or types of subject develops, with history painting, paintings that tell stories. They can be myths, they can be real histories. That was at the top of the genres, followed by portraiture, genre, which also means everyday life paintings, and landscape, with still life at the very bottom. With the collapse of monarchy and the growth of the bourgeoisie in 17th century Northern Europe in particular, the market for history paintings was relatively small, and the most successful artists, including Rembrandt, found it easier and more profitable to produce and sell large numbers of genre paintings rather than just the odd history painting or religious painting. The sheer volume of paintings produced meant that the market was flooded and prices remained very low. The historian Jonathan Israel, born in 1946, estimated that over 1.3 million paintings were produced between 1640 and 1660. And an English traveller of 1640 speaks of good paintings hanging on the walls of forges, i.e., metal workers, and cobblers, people who mend shoes and make shoes, workshops. That in the bibliography, that's the book by Fuchs, dated 1978, page 43. In general, the medieval guild system continued, ensuring a continuity. This is in Northern Europe, what we call the Northern Renaissance, ensuring a continuation of the fine brushwork skills associated with Northern painting. Master artists passed on these skills to their apprentices, and the great artists of this period required them to assist and replicate their own paintings in their studios to satisfy the demand for their work. There was also a gradual increase in academies, and more artists began to sell their paintings speculatively as a natural reaction against the commissioning culture of the former aristocratic patrons. Paintings were sold from the front rooms of workshops and traditional medieval fairs, often set up in the open air of marketplaces in places like Antwerp, famously. These became an increasingly competitive arena for the art market, just as their modern counterparts, we'll look at in more detail later, art fairs, are today. 16th century Antwerp, for example, held 6-week fairs twice a year where uncommissioned art was bought and sold by traders from across Europe. You can read more about that in Tisha Hult's book of 2017 in the bibliography, pages 139 onwards. Perhaps the most important factor governing the development of 16th and 17th century art markets in Northern Europe was the growth in the buying power of the bourgeoisie, as I've already talked about. This is best observed in the Netherlands, what we call the Low Countries, where Antwerp became the market centre for Flemish art, and where the Dutch Republic was slowly born during the 80 Years' War against Philip II and the Spanish Empire, Philip the patron of Titian we've already looked at. Whilst Antwerp, now Belgium, remained Catholic, the iconoclasm of Roman Catholic religious art, which accompanied the Dutch rebellions, Protestant rebellions, and the replacement of the religion Roman Catholicism with Calvinism, with its inherent work ethic, as well as hatred of religious imagery, led in the 17th century to a new art market for genre, everyday life, portrait and landscape paintings, as well as the continuing fashion for Greco-Roman antiquities. Vermeer, a particularly exquisite example of a genre painter. Among the few women to break into the competitive Dutch art market was this one, Judith Leister, seen here in a self-portrait, a genre painter who became a member of the Haarlem Guild of St. Luke. I've already said there's still these guilds of artists working in the Netherlands. Her works, such as famously The Proposition and this self-portrait, reflect both technical mastery and market awareness. Judith Leister's ability to sign and sell her own work and to train apprentices marks her as a rare example of a successful female artist in the 17th century commercial art world. In Edo, Japan, the merchant class similarly drove demand for these ukiyo-e prints, which depicted everyday life, courtesans, and landscapes, such as here, reflecting secular taste and a thriving urban market, and including works like the one we see here, Hiroshige's Station Hara, Mount Fuji in the morning. These prints captured everyday life, popular entertainment, courtesans, scenic landscapes, catering to secular tastes rather than elite or religious patronage. The demand for visually appealing, affordable art helped shape both the subject matter and style of ukiyo-e, reflecting the cultural priorities and leisure interests of urban consumers in cities such as Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto in Japan. The 18th century back in Europe saw several new developments in the art market. Perhaps the most important phenomenon was the Grand Tour, in which European and increasingly North American gentlemen and occasionally ladies finished their education by traveling across the Alps into Italy to absorb the visual culture of antiquity and Renaissance. This developed their aesthetic awareness and encouraged them to spend large amounts of cash on several commercial artistic activities. Local portrait painters such as the Roman Pompeo Bertoni depicted the grand tourist against a suitable background of classical ruins. This is his painting of a grand tourist, an English grand tourist. We know they're grand tourists because they'd stop in Paris on the way to Italy and they buy these suits and they had these kind of red linings that they could pull up their sleeves and show red, and they could pull down their collars and show red. Painters of vedute, or view paintings, such as Canaletto, Francesco Guardi, seen here, and Bernardo Bellotto, sold their 18th century landscapes to these gentlemen travellers on the Grand Tour to hang on the walls of their own town and country houses back home as upmarket souvenirs. And English country houses, should you have an opportunity to visit them, are filled with these. The grand tourists' desire to acquire their own ancient marbles and Renaissance paintings encouraged a lively and sometimes unethical export trade in antiquities and old masters, with local dealers making large profits from the naivety of many of the younger gentlemen. The slide, by the way, shows a sale in 2011 at Sotheby's London of this magnificent Guardi painting, A View of Venice, like a souvenir image like we might bring home today with the Rialto Bridge on the Grand Canal. One of these 18th century dealers living in Rome was Thomas Jenkins, who doubled as an English tour guide. You see him here in this portrait by Angelica Kaufman, a rare example of a woman artist, but also a woman on the Grand Tour. She had to be chaperoned in Rome. This is Jenkins' niece and the dog, and in the background, the Colosseum in Rome to show you've been to Rome. But Jenkins, he acted as a tour guide and a banker, and he used to dupe buyers into paying over the limit for over-restored and sometimes forged antiquities. His most notorious transaction was the ancient nude female marble, originally the Barberini Venus, owned by the Barberini family in Rome, and then sold to Jenkins. You see it here in the catalogue of a Christie's early New Millennium sale. This was sold to the young William Weddell that we just looked at in Battoni's painting. And Weddell wasn't an aristocrat. He was a grocer's son, i.e., somebody who sells fruit and vegetables, who'd inherited a fortune from his stock market playing uncle. This was developing in the 18th century, the stock market. The Institute in Bedford Square almost certainly lived in this magnificent building we're in, and all the other houses around Bedford Square, built in the late 18th century, time of the Grand Tour, and almost certainly paid for with money from the growing stock market profits. So anyway, Weddell paid Jenkins £2,000 for this statue, which was huge in the 18th century, plus an annuity of £100 while he was alive. And Jenkins' final profit, I've calculated, was about 6,000% at the price that Jenkins had paid the Barberini family for the work. If you want to read more about that, you can see in the bibliography I've also written a chapter in an Institute publication about the Jenkins Venus. So I'm going to just now offer some case studies which are about imperial acquisition and the global dispersal of art. So these following case studies illustrate how colonial powers, such as this country, Great Britain, acquired, then recontextualized and commodified art from across the globe. We'll look at an example from India, the British East India Company at work. I'll say more about them in a moment. Africa, colonialism in Africa, the British punitive expedition in the 19th century, the famous Benin bronzes, which are still in the British Museum, most of them, and Oceania, like the Pacific region, both West and East Pacific, ceremonial objects collected under Christian missionary and military rule, and then Latin America, Spanish looting of Aztec and Inca gold. And these examples, the reason I'm talking about them in the history of the art market, they continue to shape debates today on restitution ethics and legacy of empire. So firstly, the commercial ambitions of the European East India companies, particularly the Dutch East India Company and the British East India companies, extended beyond spices and textiles to include cultural artifacts. These companies often acted as intermediaries in the extraction and export of art and religious objects from South and Southeast Asia. Temples and palaces were looted or, quote, gifted under duress, and the resulting artifacts, sculptures, manuscripts, decorative arts, entered European collections and museums. The commodification of these objects was frequently justified through Orientalist narratives, and there's like exotic ways of displaying them, and their circulation helped shape European tastes for exoticism, while simultaneously erasing the context of their origin. So what you're looking at here, this magnificent mechanical sculpture known as Tipu's Tiger, was looted by the British East India Company following the fall of Seringapatam in 1799, and it vividly embodies the tensions of colonial encounter, a tiger mauling a European soldier, commissioned by Tipu Sultan as a symbol of resistance. Its relocation to the Victoria and Albert Museum transformed it from a political statement into a curiosity of empire. The object exemplifies how colonial powers recontextualized indigenous art to fit narratives of exoticism and conquest, and how the art market absorbed such spoils into its institutional frameworks. In Oceania, European colonial powers collected and exported ritual and ceremonial objects from indigenous communities, often without consent. Carved figures, masks and textiles from Polynesia, Melanesia, Aboriginal Australia, New Zealand were acquired through missionary networks, military campaigns, or exploitative trade. These objects were recontextualized in European museums and private collections as, quote, ethnographic curiosities, contributing to a market that commodified indigenous spirituality and craftsmanship. Today, many of these works are central to debates on cultural restitution and the ethics of colonial collecting. The one you're looking at here, it's a carved ceremonial object from Polynesia, now housed in a European ethnographic museum, and it reflects the colonial practice of collecting indigenous art under the guise of scientific or missionary endeavor. Such objects were often stripped of their cultural context and reclassified as, quote, ethnographic specimens, unquote, reinforcing hierarchies between Western art and non-Western craft. The art market's absorption of these kinds of works into private and institutional collections contributed to the erasure of indigenous agency and the exoticization of oceanic cultures. Today, they are central to debates on decolonizing museum collections. In Latin America, the Spanish and Portuguese empires looted vast quantities of indigenous art during the conquest of the Aztecs, Maya, and Inca civilizations in particular. Gold and silver artifacts, this is a gold bar from Aztec culture, were melted down while surviving sculptures, codices, manuscripts and textiles were appropriated into colonial collections or transformed into Christian devotional objects. These artifacts later entered European art markets and museums, often stripped of their original meaning and reframed through colonial narratives. The legacy of these acquisitions continues to shape the representation of Latin American cultures in global institutions and the art market. This gold bar, recovered in Mexico City, is believed to have been looted by Spanish conquistadors during the infamous Noche Triste retreat from Tenochtitlan in 1520, and it represents the material extraction that accompanied the cultural devastation of the Aztec Empire. While most gold artifacts were melted down and lost, this surviving piece offers a rare glimpse into the scale of colonial plunder. Its presence in national collections today raises questions about historical memory, the valuation of indigenous art, and the role of conquest in shaping our global art market. Colonial expansion into Africa during the 19th century brought with it systematic looting of cultural heritage. Of course, this was on the back of the slave trade, where many, many African slaves were purchased or kidnapped and shipped across to the sugar plantations, in particular, in North America. The British expedition to Benin in 1897, for example, resulted in the seizure of thousands of bronze plaques and sculptures from the royal palace, which were then sold or donated to museums across Europe. These objects became part of the European art market, often stripped of their original ceremonial and historical significance. The Benin bronzes remain emblematic of the unresolved tensions between colonial acquisition and contemporary restitution debates, with increasing calls for their return to modern Nigeria. These works, originally part of a sophisticated royal court tradition, were dispersed across European museums and private collections. The view you're seeing here is in the British Museum, I'm afraid to say. Their removal marked a turning point in the commodification of African art, reframing sacred and historical artifacts as decorative objects. The Benin bronzes continued to challenge museum ethics and provoke restitution debates, revealing the art market's complicity in colonial violence and its legacy in shaping our Western tastes. Back to the West. At the end of the 18th century, the French Revolution, I've already referred to it, had a profound effect on the art market, releasing massive amounts of fine and decorative art looted and confiscated from the former monarchy and aristocracy to be sold at famous auctions to the art collectors of other European nations. Titian's record-breaking £50 million Dinah and Actaeon, we've already looked at, was purchased, as I said before, by the British coal magnate Francis Egerton during the sale of the property of the dispossessed French aristocrat, the Duke of Orleans, in 1798. Egerton was just one of hundreds of nouveau riche middle-class British industrialists who now joined traditional aristocrats in the cultures of collecting. To enter high society, it was essential to acquire and display in your town and country houses the best examples of the fine and decorative arts. Good example in London, the Wallace collection. Take a look at that, at its history. It's free to enter, amazing collection. The economic boom of the Industrial Revolution, as we call it, which enriched one of the reasons that I've already talked about, the stock market in London in the late 18th century. We also had the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution before anywhere else in Europe, earlier in the 18th century. This leads to an economic boom in this country. And the overnight creation of nouveau riche speculators also saw the foundation in London and other major British cities of today's most successful art dealers and international auction houses. Sotheby's was founded in 1744 and dealt mainly in the sale of important books and libraries, equal with art as signifiers of culture and wealth, until in 1917 it moved to its present Bond Street premises and began to sell paintings and works of art. Christie's was founded in 1766 and specialized in fine and decorative art, becoming particularly successful in its sales of post-French Revolutionary art objects and moving to its current King Street, St. James location in 1823. This is a wonderful satirical painting by James Gilray showing an actress viewing a classical history painting. She has taste, whilst her nouveau riche husband, drunk too much wine, is looking at the sporting painting. It's basically a painting showing foxes tearing to bits of, sorry, hounds tearing to bits a fox. Luckily, this practice in the UK was outlawed at the end of the last millennium. Bonhams was established in, I'm just going to show you these now, actually. There's Sotheby's in its current Bond Street location. No doubt you've been there or will certainly go there during the next year. Christie's likewise in St. James's Street. And we've also got, and then we've got Bonhams also in Bond Street. And then we've also got Phillips also in Mayfair. And the importance of historical tradition in the global art market is evident in the fact that today all four London auction houses remain competitive international art businesses, and they were all founded in the late 18th century on the back of the economic boom in this country. Like the ancient Romans, the British were avid collectors of old art, purchasing from secondary art market sources such as auctions and old master dealers. Alongside this culture of collecting antiquities and old masters, the establishment of institutions such as the Royal Academy, 1768, there was an equivalent in Paris, France, with its training of contemporary British artists and summer selling exhibitions, I've just been to the current one in the Royal Academy, led to increasing patronage of living artists and the development of the primary art market, where works are purchased from the artist and or their agent dealer immediately, spontaneously from them, not from a gallery dealing in already bought and sold art or an auction house. Wealthy patrons and social celebrities would display their own portraits painted by late 18th century British artists such as Gainsborough or Reynolds on their staircases and perhaps obtain a Constable or Turner landscape from the Royal Academy exhibitions for their drawing room walls. Alongside the birth of the great auction houses during these years of increasing urbanization, economic growth, the late 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries witnessed the expansion of the art market in the major metropolises of the Western world, with the establishment of many of today's important commercial galleries in the most upmarket districts of London, Paris, and other European cities, as well as New York. Carnegie, seen on this slide, is arguably the oldest London secondary art market dealer, with a print selling business active in Paris in the 1770s, followed by the opening of London premises in the Haymarket in 1781, Pall Mall in 1786, and eventually their current location until about 15 years ago, I think it was, they were in Bond Street. Because of rising rates that art galleries have had to pay in Bond Street, they've all moved, most of them have moved out now. Carnegie's is now near Christie's in south of Piccadilly in St. James. Still a very posh area, by the way. Rudolf Ackermann, now Arthur Ackermann Limited, established another very early London art dealership in 1783. And Agnew's, which had begun in Manchester in 1817, Manchester and Birmingham, these are big, very wealthy industrial centres in the late 18th, early 19th centuries with their own wealthy population and art collectors and museums. So Agnew's opens in Bond Street, London in 1876, having been founded in Manchester. Likewise, Frost and Reed set up business in Bristol, the thriving seaport in West England in 1808, and then moved to Duke Street, St. James, London in 1908. Like the big four auction houses, these four early British art dealers remain very much alive in the international art world, although Carnegie and Agnew's, like Sotheby's and Christie's, have emerged as the most famous and successful of these. Mayfair and St James, north and south of Piccadilly, remain the epicenter of the established secondary art market trade in London, with outliers in Kensington, Chelsea, and Pimlico. Uh, Tends to be in the east end of London, out towards Hackney, from Shoreditch to Hackney, that we get the exciting emerging contemporary art galleries, by the way. No doubt you will discover this. So back to the 18th century, another aspect we need to look at is archaeology. So the increase in archaeological discoveries, such as Pompeii, south of Naples in Italy, during the 18th and 19th centuries led to the unethical and increasingly illegal trading in antiquities, a problem which remains very much at the forefront of today's art news. In Italy, the buried cities of Herculaneum and Pompeii, covered within 48 hours by volcanic matter from Mount Vesuvius in the Bay of Naples in 79 CE, were rediscovered in the 18th century and became a popular extension to the Grand Tour, continuing through the 19th century. The early excavations were apparently little more than treasure hunts to decorate the Bourbon dynasty palaces in and around Naples, and many other objects found their way onto the black market and were sold to the gentlemen travellers. In the later 18th century, English travellers visited Turkish-occupied Greece, and for the first time recorded and sometimes removed the classical monuments, most notoriously from the Parthenon and other Acropolis marbles, which were transported by Lord Elgin, ambassador to Turkey based in Athens. He transported those marbles infamously to London in the early years of the 19th century. And this led to a mania for anything Greek. And the new Philhellenic attitude argued that the English-led Greek revival, as it was known here, was a superior movement even to the Italian Renaissance, because we were now looking at the real thing, not the later Roman replication of earlier Greek art, it was argued. Ancient sites in Greece and Turkey became the new target for archaeological plundering. Many of our Western museums remain filled with objects from these places. Although UNESCO brought in guidelines for the protection of cultural property in the 1970s, very few strict laws have been passed, and the illicit export and import of antiquities of bad provenance, as we call it, remains a big issue, as you will learn, in today's art market. By the way, this is a watercolor by this gentleman dressed as a Turk who's sitting. His name's Athenian Stewart. He's a British traveller, and he's painting scenes on the Acropolis in Athens. And this is what the famous temple Erechtheum, built in the 5th century BCE, still standing on the Acropolis in Athens, albeit, obviously some ruins. And with the caryatid porch, it had been turned into a harem by the Turkish sultans. So in the later 18th century, English travellers, so here we are. Yes, this is the mania for anything Greek. So this is a caryatid that Elgin brought back, a woman in place of a column, and it's now in the British Museum. And the new Acropolis Museum has an embarrassing gap where the 5 original caryatids from the Acropolis have been removed from the public domain because of pollution in Athens and placed in the air-conditioned filtered museum in Athens, and they're waiting. That new museum of the Acropolis was very much built hoping for the return of the Parthenon Elgin marbles. I don't know what you want to call them. I did actually have a letter to the Financial Times weekend published about a year ago where I argued that this is a misnomer. They're not the Parthenon marbles, they're the Acropolis marbles, because the marbles that Elgin brought back, like this one, aren't from the Parthenon. The Parthenon is a specific temple. This is from a different temple. The 18th and 19th centuries produced the world's first public museums and art galleries. Well, in the modern period. And also, I've been in Rome recently, and in the late 15th century, the Capitoline Museum is arguably the first, an early public museum. But these are vital importance to the art market, these museums, for several reasons. Objects in their collections offer a benchmark for similar objects appearing on the art market. The academic culture of the museum world means that art objects are assessed objectively with little or no importance given to monetary value. This enables art dealers and collectors alike to appraise market objects in terms of the scholarly cataloguing of their museum equivalents. Objective criteria for ascertaining dates, producing descriptions, contextual understandings are provided by this public service. Indeed, most national museums have a free appraisal service enabling the dealer or collector to obtain a scholarly opinion of an object. This can be a valuable way of ascertaining whether an object is a fake or forgery, for example. Scholarly opinion of museum curators is also very often used for marketing art objects. The 19th century boom in the number of public museums also increased the desire for private acquisition of objects similar to those on display in the museums, and this continues to produce symbiotic tensions between the private and public sectors. It's somewhat significant that the core foundation collection of the National Gallery London, seen in the slide, consisted of the 38 paintings bought on the private art market by the banker John Julius Angerstein. And the British, this is catalogued as #1, used to be in Angerstein's collection, now in the National Gallery, the great painting of the Raising of Lazarus, the great Mannerist canvas by Sebastiano del Piombo. But 38 of these paintings, so the British government pay Angerstein's estate £57,000, huge amount of money, the year after Angerstein's death. So it goes to his descendants, his family. The accessibility of art in public galleries also informs public taste, of course. The presence or absence of a certain type of art gallery in a city can affect the market because there's always a tendency to collect what is locally fashionable. So the taste for collecting old master paintings and drawings was fostered by the opening to the London public of the Bridgewater acquisitions from the Paris Orleans post-French Revolution sale, in which the two famous Titians were purchased. These paintings first went on view in 1806 in the Stafford Gallery at Cleveland House, London. 2,000 guests attended the opening, and overnight, high society in London developed a hunger for old masters. On the other hand, throughout the 19th century, London had no gallery dedicated to the display of international modern art until 1917, when it was decided to convert the Tate Gallery, opened in 1897 as a gallery of British art, paid for by the ethically dodgy sugar magnate Henry Tate, into a museum of modern national and international art. Until this had happened, only travellers to Paris were exposed to the new modernity of the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and Cubists. During the late 19th century, the emergence of the entrepreneurial art dealer as a catalyst for the national and international promotion of emerging artists is especially apparent in the career of Frenchman Paul Durand-Ruel, who pioneered the modern art market idea that the triangular relationship between artist, dealer, and collector is essential for their mutual cultural and financial success. In the 20th century, the art market began to develop by leaps and bounds. Important commercial galleries began to increase in number in New York in the 1920s, and the market became truly international. The secondary market became increasingly segmented, with dealers and collectors focusing on one specific period or type of fine or decorative art, a legacy which can still be observed today in the titles of auctions, antiquities, old masters, impressionist and modern, post-war contemporary. This is, however, beginning to change with the new millennial fashion for cross-collecting, leading to the intermixing of works from different sectors and geographies and times in both auction sales and galleries. One particularly heavy shadow, however, is cast over the art market during the 20th century. This is the effect of modern warfare and extreme political ideologies on the art world. During the period 1933 to 1945, the Nazi Party in Germany pursued a meticulously planned strategy of art looting from their political enemies, particularly the fine art and cultural object collections of wealthy Jewish families. Although many of these were found and returned by the Allies at the end of the war, it's believed that thousands are still missing, and that many are being bought and sold on the art market with no knowledge of their illegal provenance history. Databases are now available to check works which are known to have been looted in this manner, and some high-profile legal cases have occurred within the last generation which have served to highlight this historical problem. The most famous case was that of the portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, you're viewing it here, painted in 1907 by Gustav Klimt, confiscated by the Nazis when Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, husband of the sitter, fled Germany in 1938. The painting was eventually returned by the Austrian state. It had entered the Vienna Kunsthistorische Museum to the descendant of the Bloch-Bauer family, Maria Altmann, who then sold it in June 2006 in a private treaty sale for $135 million to the perfume magnate Ronald Lauder, in whose Manhattan Neue Gallery it now hangs. In the Institute Library, by the way, you can borrow the DVD of the film. I think it's called Woman in Gold with Meryl Streep as playing Maria Altmann. But I would warn you, apparently there's some inconsistencies and non-truths in that very, very brilliant movie account. After World War II, art collecting also became increasingly glamorous, and one particular event in 1958 might be said to have changed the art market forever. This was the famous Goldschmidt sale, which was the marketing brainchild of this man in the slide at the auction podium in Sotheby's, Peter Wilson, director of Sotheby's between 1957 and 80. Peter Wilson's idea was to create both media interest and increase public interest in the art market by holding a high quality auction for the first time in the evening as a black tie event, as we call it, with a VIP guest list. It was an unprecedented success with celebrities such as Lady Churchill, Somerset Maugham, Anthony Quinn, Kirk Douglas in attendance. Just 7 paintings were selected for the sale. All were Impressionists, post-Impressionists or modern, and all sold within 21 minutes for a record at the time grand total of £781,000. The idea that it was cool to buy classic modern art as well as old masters was also born, and the notion of the auction as a spectacular celebrity event remains with us today. By the way, this Manet self-portrait sold in this sale for £65,000 in 1958, sold earlier in the new millennium for £22 million. One of the most influential 20th century dealers was this man, Leo Castelli, who created a thriving market for post-war artists in New York, coinciding with the demise of Paris as the center of the international art world, as it had been at the time of early Picasso and so on, and the rise of the United States of America as a global economic leader following World War II. In the same way that the market for Impressionism and post-Impressionism was stimulated and marketed by the dealer Duran Ruel, the abstract expressionists and pop artists were fostered by Castelli. You can see in this poster of an exhibition, the Rauschenberg painting. Quote, the function of an art dealer, of a good art dealer, a dealer who really cares about art and not about making money, should be to find new artists, to make them known to the public before museums can do it. We're the real vanguard. That's what Castelli said, quoted in Hook, 2017, page 244. Castelli was the primary art dealer par excellence, who preferred to be referred to as a gallerist because of the way he discovered and promoted emerging artists. We're still very much living with that legacy, by the way. And the role of Peggy Guggenheim has been much underrated until recently. Today's contemporary art dealers owe much to Castelli's and Guggenheim's repositioning of the art dealer as cultural leader. However, some have prophesied that the advent of the internet, websites and social media could mark the beginning of the end of the dealer's part in the triangle, with their demise brought about by the increase in direct online sales from artist to collector. You see Peggy here hanging a Calder work, which is still in her famous collection in Venice on the Grand Canal. So here's an image of that relationship. We've got the collector Francois Pinault, the artist Jeff Koons, and the dealer Larry Gagosian, all befriending one another and all relying on one another as a triangle of creating more cultural value and market value with between themselves. But others would argue that the social function of the artist dealer collector triangle is so strong that it will simply absorb and integrate the new technologies into its structures. I believe that's still happening at the moment. Perhaps the greatest boost for artists, dealers, collectors in the new millennium has been the exponential increase in the numbers of international art fairs. These may be divided into contemporary art fairs, selling work on the primary art market, such as Art Basel and its offshoots, FIAC, which has now also become Basel in Paris, and Frieze in London and elsewhere, and antique art fairs, including Frieze Masters now, selling antiquities, old masters, and secondary market modern masters, such as TFAF, the European Fine Art Foundation and Fair. Dealers rent stands and expose their art and artists to far greater numbers than their permanent gallery could ever attract. The cultural aspects of both types of fair, contemporary and classic, are propagated alongside market aspects, continuing the legacy of dealer gallerists such as Peggy Guggenheim and Leo Castelli. The performance of the art market is inextricably linked to the externalities of the financial world. Art market indices based on published auction results for both individual artists and sectors, together with more recent annual art market reports, which include commercial dealer sales based on confidentiality surveys, demonstrate the correlation between the economic health of an art market and the state of the broader global economy. So, for example, historically in the 1980s, the economic boom in Japan was accompanied by the collecting by Japanese businessmen, it was nearly always men, of high-end Impressionist and post-Impressionist French paintings as exotic objects moving into Eastern culture from Western culture. In 1990, just before the global economy fell into deep depression, the Japanese paper magnate Saito purchased 2 trophy paintings for record auction prices. So on the 15th of May, Christie's, New York, Saito purchased this painting, Van Gogh's Portrait of Dr. Gachet, one version of it, for $82.5 million, which is now the equivalent. Well, we'll see what the equivalent is in a moment. It's allowing for inflation. That would now be a huge amount of money. This, by the way, this painting had originally been in the Stahl Museum, 1911, and it was confiscated by Goering, a Nazi art collector, during the Nazi years of World War II. Its whereabouts then became it's where it then was sold at Christie's. It made its way into a Parisian dealership, was sold at Christie's, and no one batted an eyelid in 1990. You can see how things changed. So literally this phenomenon of provenance research has become huge in the new millennium because no one ever really challenged this. And by the way, the whereabouts of Saito's purchase, which is believed to be better than the one in the D'Orsay, we still don't know where it is. Here's just 2 days later, Saito at Sotheby's, this time in New York, painted Renoir's famous Bal du Moulin de la Galette for $78.1 million. It's now in the D'Orsay. Sorry, this is the version in the D'Orsay. He painted another version. So allowing for inflation, we can see that the Van Gogh, by the way, the premiums that buyers were paying in those days were half of what they are today, only 10%. That painting would now be worth $198 million. And the Renoir would be worth $188 million, slightly less. Now, Saito, who bought these 2 paintings, infamously announced that the 2 paintings would go to the grave with him when he died. But it's now believed that they both survive in unnamed private collections, with the Renoir having been resold in 1997 for around $50 million in a private treaty sale brokered by Sotheby's. Such private treaty sales brokered by auction houses become more and more frequent, with more and more wealthy collectors preferring the anonymity of the private treaty sale rather than the publicity of an auction. The current global economic recession, with its attendant volatility in traditional financial markets, has encouraged the wealthy to view art as an alternative investment asset. World records for all art market sectors continue to be broken on a regular basis, both at auction and in private dealing. And this is currently the world record for any work of art at auction. And you can see how its value would now be $577 million. We still don't quite know who it was sold to. at the time it was believed it would be on display in the Louvre, Abu Dhabi, or we now think it might have been sold to someone in Saudi Arabia, but it's not currently, as far as I know, on public display. I apologize if that's now not true. So over the last generation and well into our new millennium, two major changes have taken place in the art market. Firstly, it's become truly international or even global, with emerging economies such as what we used to call the BRIC nations, BRIC, that was Brazil, Russia, India, China in the early millennium, and the oil-rich Middle East and Emirates now playing a major role in buying and selling of art. Collectors from Nigeria, South Africa, and Brazil are increasingly shaping contemporary art markets, supporting local artists in their own countries and establishing institutions that challenge Western dominance. The slide shows the growth of Art Ex Lagos illustrates this increasing diversification and internationalization of art market players in Africa. The fair was founded in 2016 by the Nigerian entrepreneur and collector Tokini Peterside Shvebig. You can see here on the right of this slide. The fair has become West Africa's leading platform for contemporary art, attracting local patrons alongside international collectors, curators, and critics. Over its 8 editions to date, Artex Lagos has showcased both established and emerging artists from Africa and the diaspora, offering gallery exhibitions, talks, live performances, and film screenings. Its expansion, culminating in hybrid online editions during the COVID-19 pandemic and a successful return after the pandemic to in-person fairs, demonstrates the rising influence of regional art fairs in connecting local markets to global audiences and fostering a dynamic ecosystem of artists, collectors, and cultural intermediaries. Complementing the rise of regional fairs like Art Ex Lagos, the 154 Contemporary African Art Fair has played a pivotal role in connecting African and diasporic artists to global markets. Founded in 2013, 154, which means One Nation, 54 Countries, is the first international art fair dedicated exclusively to contemporary African art. With annual editions now in London, New York, and Marrakesh, where it's founded, in Morocco, in North Africa, the fair showcases leading galleries and artists from across the continent and its diaspora. Through curated exhibitions, talks, and special projects, 154 has helped elevate African art within the global market, fostering critical discourse and expanding collector interest. Its name references, as I've said, the 54 countries of Africa. We have a tendency in the West to just say, oh, this is Africa, this is China, this is Latin America. How many nations are in Latin America, I ask all of you? How many can answer that? How many in Africa? 54. So, and these all have national traditions and their own art markets, some of them more successful than others. But these fairs also reflect the growing leadership of women in shaping contemporary art markets. Tokini Peterside Shvebig, the founder of Artex Lagos, and Toria Algloe, seen here, founder of 154, have created platforms that elevate the African and diasporic artists while redefining global market dynamics. But their curatorial vision and entrepreneurial acumen demonstrates how women are increasingly central to the infrastructure and innovation of today's art world. The good news for the art market today is that increasing numbers of nations are now competing for the same art. So at present, it would appear to be a win-win situation when compared to other financial and investment sectors. Secondly, it's become for better or worse, far more transparent. The internet means that with the click of a mouse, anyone can see what was sold at auction on the other side of the world a few hours ago. It therefore becomes impossible for dealers and auctioneers to sell an object in London a few months after it has failed to sell in Hong Kong, for example, without the new set of buyers being aware of the original market failure. Subscription databases are also publicly available, which enable dealers, auction house experts, as well as collectors and us students to analyze past sales performance of artists, their individual works, and even entire art market sectors. An understanding of the history of the art market is, it is hoped, fascinating per se, and more importantly, in order to have a clear vision of our current market, as well as to make informed and rational predictions of its future behavior, I believe it's essential to understand the dynamics of historical markets, how visual culture, private and public ownership of art, the public taste, or what the Germans call Zeitgeist, of any period are all interrelated and bear constantly changing relationships with our own increasingly networked world. So what are the key takeaways from my talks? Art is a commodity. From prehistoric fertility figures to NFTs, art has consistently functioned as a tradable object shaped by cultural, spiritual, and economic forces. Market dynamics, patronage, competition, branding, replication have driven value creation across centuries, from classical Greece to contemporary fairs. Colonial legacies, imperial acquisitions and looting have left enduring ethical challenges, now central to debates on restitution and museum practice in the art market as well as the public sector. Globalisation and transparency, the rise of international art fairs, digital platforms. Market data has transformed access, visibility, and valuation. And continuities and shifts. While the players and platforms evolve, core tensions between creativity and commerce, authenticity and replication very much remain. Thank you very much for listening, and I leave you with the same bibliography that I left you in the first half.